So, so you went to law school, then you were on the force, and then you came out of that and you studied and you started really studying history in a real way, and you wrote a book, Birth of a White Nation. Yeah. So in that, like in the book, you refer to the term the creation of white people. Can you just elaborate on what that means?
Well, sure. But prior to a specific moment in time in colonial North American history, if you look in the legal record of English colonial law, you will not see a single reference to anyone called a white person. Not one. Because white people didn't yet exist. After 1681, in Maryland and Virginia, you'll start to see a slew of laws passed that reference this entirely new group of humanity called white people. Before white was asserted as a group of people, what you'll see are references to English and other Christians, or just Christians, or they'll, in the criminal record specifically, they'll reference one's nation of origin, the Dutchman, the Irish woman, for example. But nowhere is there anyone called a white person.
Yeah, and I have to say, when the first time I started working with Hoppy, and I was looking at it, and you said that, I was like, who is this white woman? Because you literally lay it down. For all of you that have not seen Hoppy, I don't understand why you have not seen it yet. You've got to watch this film, because the through line of like all the things that you're saying, you build upon this whole, like the beginning of like where we are now in America. It's like a nice little trail to that. All right. So now in, the birth of this like new nation, what role did the politics and the economics play in it?
Well, that was the core of all of it. It was the impetus. It was the driving force. Look, white people lawmakers don't typically invent an entirely new group of humanity unless it's to serve a purpose, right? Or to respond to particular needs. So the answer to why they bothered to invent this new group of people is because there was a massive rebellion that engulfed the colony of Virginia for well over a year. And in this rebellion, people of African descent and people of European and English descent were all united against the 1%, the ruling elite. And they also retaliated against Native Americans. So we can't hold up Bacon's rebellion as this model of how we want to be, because the first phase of it was a complete slaughter of indigenous people. Wow. The second, I know, too bad, right? Because we need a model historically, right, of something to hold up. The second phase of it, though, was this unified front against the ruling elite. And so when the ruling elite finally, after well over a year, they finally put down the rebellion, but it was only after England sent in troops. Like, it was a really huge rebellion. And so when they finally put it down, and here I rely heavily on the research of Theodore Allen. And what he reveals to us is that the ruling elite in Virginia communicated to the legal oversight authority in London, who had the oversight over the laws of all the English colonies. And they told the ruling elite in Virginia, said, hey, don't worry about this. We've got it under control. And they explicitly said that we intend to deploy a divide and conquer strategy. And it's only after they expressed that we now see white people. White people are asserted, and the entire social context of the colony is radically transformed. Now, here's an important piece. Prior to the assertion of this new group of people called white people, persons of African descent and persons of English descent who worked on the same plantation, they were treated the same. They lived daily life the same. They ate together, they slept together, they worked together. There was no hierarchy or division on plantations. Persons of African descent were claimed as enslaved, which is a big difference. And persons of European descent, the masses of laborers, came as indentured servants, which was for a term of years. So that's a huge difference that we can't overlook. And at the same time, we know that it was not at all uncommon for there to be free people of African descent. So some were able to purchase their freedom because they could have side jobs. You work all day on the plantation, and then you had skills that you could use to accumulate resources to buy your freedom, that of others. That was the number one route to freedom for persons of African descent. And the second way was through wills and trusts of plantation owners. They freed those who they held as enslaved. And so free men of African descent and free English men had the same rights and privileges as a matter of law, the same. People, Black men could vote, and they did. They could own enslaved persons of African descent. Some did. They could own European indentured servants. They did, etc.
Okay. So now, wait, when you were saying the difference between the enslaved Africans and indentured people that came over. Now, were the indentured people also like brutalized and whipped and stuff like that? Or I mean,
yeah, they began to be. Part of what gave rise to the rebellion was heightened mistreatment of persons who were indentured and enslaved. Their treatment just generally got much worse. And the reason for it is that up until about the 1660s, there was always a readily available labor supply from England. England had a population boom throughout that period. And so there were tons of people who couldn't work, couldn't find jobs, who would get scooped up into workhouses or in prisons because it was a crime to be poor. So they would get, and they would get sent over to work via a term of indenture. So when that ended, and it ended around the 1660s, what the plantation owners were absolutely panicked about how they're going to have the labor supply they need to get all the work done of tobacco farming, because it's incredibly labor intensive. And so what they began to do was to impose really harsh punishments on the people who labored for them, whether as enslaved or indentured. And they added bunches of years to one's term of indenture for really minor infractions. And they began imposing whippings and other much harsher treatment. So that's part of what led to Bacon's rebellion in the first place, was this just heightened harsh treatment.
Okay. What was Bacon's name? I mean, where was he?
Yeah, Nathaniel Bacon in Virginia. And he actually was among the, he wasn't elite, but he wasn't bad off. You know, he imagined himself being in the House of Burgess in Virginia, but he was disgusted with how the Virginia ruling elite failed to respond violently to Native Americans who he believed had killed 3 of his neighbors' indentured servants.
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, Africans. I hope you're doing fine where you are, and if you ain't doing fine, please do fine where you are. It's always good to be fine, yeah? So I once did a video, some few months ago, I did a video about Jacqueline Batalora. You may have heard of that name, Jacqueline Batalora. She's a white professor in the United States of America, and she teaches about history, the black history, white history, all together. So there's one particular book that she's known for, and this book is called Birth of a White Nation, you know, Birth of a White Nation. It's a metaphorical title, and there's a reason for that, you know. Now, let's have a dive at this book before I give you the context of the video. The invention of white people and its relevance today focuses on the social and legal construction of whiteness in colonial America. You know, Jacqueline Batalora's argument challenged the notion of white as a natural or inherent category. Here is how she breaks it down, you know. First thing is we see the word white, the birth of a white nation. So white has been used here metaphorically to mean something, you know. So white, or rather whiteness, is a legal construct that was created in America in order to protect a certain group of people, you know, or rather to give them privilege over other groups of people. So whiteness. Jacqueline Batalora argues that whiteness was not a pre-existing biological reality, but a legal and social invention. Basically, whiteness was invented by those people who I like calling them imperialists. Those people I like calling them colonialists. I also like calling them the slave masters, because they wanted to make sure that they protect and they silent their cognitive dissonance. Now, Jacqueline Batalora also traces the development of laws in the 17th century American colonies that explicitly defined and privileged white people. The third point is Jacqueline emphasizes the significance of laws that differentiated between people of European descent and those of African descent, creating a hierarchy. So creating whiteness was like creating a ladder, creating a boundary, creating a bridge to separate categories, so that when they wanted to enslave you, they will enslave you easily, saying that you are below me and now you will serve me. You get the idea? Now, we had some roles of this law in creating racial hierarchy. You know, Jacqueline Batalora's work highlights how laws were used to establish and maintain a system of social dominance. You know, these laws, as Jacqueline Batalora puts it, granted specific rights and privilege to those classified as white while denying them to others. The third point is the legal framework of this whiteness solidified the concept of whiteness also as a state of power. Now, the legal framework that was used to reinforce this concept of whiteness now became a status of power. You see a white person, you see a powerful guy, because they enforced a law that whiteness is great, you know. I believe that this notion had to be challenged, you know, challenging the notion of inherent race. But Alora's analysis directly challenges the idea that race is a biological or natural category, you know. Race is not biological or natural category. It's not. It's a legal invention. It's an invention that we humans have invented, you know, to satisfy our selfish needs. Jacqueline demonstrates how racial categories are socially constructed and historically contingent. You know, they depend on one another. This depends on that, that depends on this. If whiteness was a biological thing, it wouldn't be contingent. It would be necessary, because things exist in two ways. Either they become contingent or they become necessary. Contingent beings or contingent properties are things which need others for them to survive, you know. Like me, myself here, I am a contingent being. I exist because my parents came together. But a necessary being like God, the only reason for existence is found within himself, and him only himself is the reason for his own existence. So he doesn't need something else to make him exist. I hope you get the point. So if race was necessary, it would be biological, but it is not biological. Race is a legal social construct. Jacqueline points out that prior to those laws, that people of European descent were not considered a single unified racial group. You understand? There is deep to what Jacqueline Batalora gives in this video. I want us to dive in, watch it. I shall get back with a deep, critical analysis. Let's dive in.
I believed the stories about this country, about what makes it great, right? Here is a nation that promises liberty and justice for all. And I believed in that and wanted to be part of that. And so I went to law school. And then as I began learning more honest US history, especially in relation to law, you know, that whole idea, like I couldn't hold it anymore. And so I've been committed to exploring whiteness and unpacking white supremacy within our law and society ever since.
Wow. How do you feel like the work that you're doing? How has it changed you? Like, were you always, were you always like this, or?
Definitely not.
Wow.
I have become a better white person, and I'm still.
I wasn't gonna say nothing.
Well, look, I was born into the same culture and society you were, right? And it told me that people who look like me made this country, created all its important institutions. We're great. We're wonderful. We define beauty, intelligence. Like I learned all that. And when I realized that those were productions that were falsely created in order to justify the dehumanization of people of African descent, indigenous people, and many others, how could I not be changed? I've been really committed to understanding really what it means to be white ever since, and I'm still very much exploring that.
Wow. So, like, what did your family think? Like, are your family? I mean, like, because you just like come home and then one day, you're like in a happy documentary, laying it out for everybody. But like, how did that go over?
Well, my parents for a very long time were like, "Wait, you're still studying race, and wait, still whiteness?" They didn't get it. But my father, he passed away 6 years ago, but right before he passed, he had to sit at the hospital getting fluids in him for his treatment, chemo. And while he was sitting there, he read my whole book, Birth of a White Nation.
Oh, wow.
And he called me up as soon as he finished it. And he just said, "I just finished your book, and I want you to know how proud I am." I mean, it was one of my most, it's probably the first time I've said it without crying. It was a wonderful moment, because for the first time, I knew had he lived much longer, he never would have asked me again, "You're still researching whiteness?" Because he got it. Yeah.
Wow. So when you talk to like other white folks about whiteness, are they like, how do they react?
Sure. Well, let me tell you something. There's two different versions of that group.
Okay.
I get hired by people mostly to talk to white people, right? People of color don't need so much the insights I bring. Maybe the history is helpful for sure, but in terms of what the history means today, people of color are living it, in a way that that doesn't require some white woman to tell them, but white people do. And so when I'm invited to talk to those groups of white people, I have for the most part, really good receptions. Sometimes, for example, when I've been, I'm trying to remember her name. She used to be on Fox, and then Trump said something bad to her. And anyway, I can't remember her name, but she had sent in some journalists to videotape while I was presenting at the white privilege conference. And so I got
wait. There's a white privilege conference.
It's been around 20 years. Eddie Moore Jr. is the founder. Oh, you have to be there, Felicia.
Oh, I didn't know about this.
Oh,
okay. Yep. All right. Go ahead. The white privilege conference.
White privilege conference. So I'm presenting some of this history as a keynote speaker, and they illegally filmed it. And then I saw myself on Fox News. I actually didn't see myself. I heard myself as they were playing.
Oh my gosh.
Anyway, so I got boatloads of hate mail. And so I get, death threats on occasion, definitely hate mail. But for most of the white people for whom I am brought in to speak, to their company, to their agency, their non-for-profit, their university, their school, I have very positive responses from white people. But when I try to talk to white people who are my friends, that's a different deal. Or family, right? Uncle Joe, everybody has an Uncle Joe. And so that's very different. Why? Because they they don't have a boss who brought me in, who kind of forces them to actually learn the damn history, right? People who are my friends or my family expect me to be able to have a, you know, just a conversation of a sound bite that's going to radically teach them everything they need to know. And it doesn't work that way. I can't give you a damn sound bite that's going to help you know this history, right? We have to sit and go through it.
Yeah.
And so for me, those are the most frustrating. So I find, for me, for those who are my friends who absolutely don't get this, who are white, and who are relatives who do not get this and who are white, you know, the all lives matter folks.
Yes.
You know, I'm talking, yeah. So I find that the best way, the more success I've had with that group is to just, when they see me, especially in public settings, and I get to see and I'm also around my friends who are of African descent, indigenous, Latinx, etc., then my family and my friends see that I have much deeper relationships with people who aren't white than they do, right? So that's in those ways I am most able to influence them. But, you know, people who don't want to sit and actually learn enough to change, there's not a lot that can be done.
Yeah. And when you've had these conversations, has there any, you know, because it's one thing to like hear it and to sometimes to hear it is really painful. You know, I know it is for me when I you know, have to hear the facts about what has happened. I mean, definitely living in it, you know, but hearing it, you know, but in terms of action, is there anything that they do, or do they like contact you later and say how did they, you know, how did it move them to action? You know, like, you know this information, but it's moved you to action. So,
right.
You know,
well, yeah. I'm always telling people that there's nowhere not to start, right? Like it can feel overwhelming because whiteness it's everywhere, in everything, and in all of us, right? And so it can feel overwhelming, but that also means that there's nowhere not to start. So we all have spheres of influence, and we all just have our own selves, right? And so I encourage people to like pay attention to yourself. There's all kinds of things to do to help us grow away from white supremacy and toward a criticality of it. You know, read some history, read people of color. If you're white, especially, get in an affinity group that's good critically. Get involved, start going to the white privilege conference and all these other, you know, places where you're gonna get challenged, and people aren't gonna take your white shit. They're gonna name it and say, not here, no, and you're also gonna get love, and you're gonna grow.
Wow. Okay, yeah, I have to look up this white privilege conference. That sounds right up my alley, actually. Okay, so you know, you were doing this research and you were on the force. Do you ever work with the police department, like in Chicago? Have you worked with them?
Not in Chicago, interestingly enough. I've worked with other police departments, some campus university police departments, and in other states, I've worked with police departments, but not in Chicago.
Okay. And are they receptive?
Well, they invited me, so.
Okay.
You know, and I'm pretty clear about what I'm about. You know, that I talk about institutionalized white supremacy, and like what I hope about my work, or a critical piece that the work reveals, is that whiteness has been done to all of us. You know, like it's not my fault. It's not my grandparents, my great grandparents, and all of us are just stuck with a society that's built on white supremacy, and so it means we live it differently, very differently, much more materially painful. For people excluded from whiteness than white people, for sure. But I think when people hear the history, it makes it just so clear that it's not personal, right? The cause of this inequality, this racial inequality, you didn't do it. None of us did it, but we can all really do something about it. So some of the defensiveness that white people typically manifest can really diminish.
Yeah. And why do you think white people are defensive? And I know you don't speak for all white folks.
Yeah,
but,
for sure.
Yeah, but like, why do you think that they're so defensive? Like when you say things, when you're just speaking the truth.
Well, whiteness equips us. I'm so sorry for my pooch. That's my dog, everyone.
Yeah.
Whiteness guides us to behave that way. Like, and it's just like white fragility, that Robin DiAngelo has so brilliantly articulated. Whiteness creates the expectations that white people have, and that cause us to respond defensively, because we're provided whiteness generation after generation. Provides us with this sort of cushion of protection, of being seen as the ones who matter. I mean, literally, we've been made the ones who matter as a matter of one policy, right? And so that creates expectations generation after generation. And so that's where that defensiveness comes from. That's where what creates the context for white fragility to get manifested.
Okay. Okay. Oh, there's some similarities here, Dr. Badalora.
Right?
He was just, got fed up and he moved into action. Okay. So going back to the laws. So the law of coverture.
Yeah.
What role did that play? Well, first of all, what is the law of coverture? And then what role did it play like in building America?
Sure. Well, the law of coverture grew out of feudal England, first of all. And so when the English came over to, move out indigenous people and establish colonies in North America, they brought the law of coverture with them. And so what it did was establish relations between men and women. And it's sort of famously described by the famous English barrister Blackstone, who describes the law of coverture in this way, which, by the way, is established in and through marriage. And so he says, in marriage, the two are made one, and the one is the man. And literally, as a matter of law, that's what happened. As soon as she said, I do, and any legal presence she may have had transferred to her husband. So she couldn't enter a contract. She couldn't sue. She had no right to her own wages. She couldn't create a will or trust on her own behalf. And if she were sexually assaulted, her husband had the claim against the assailant. Literally no legal recognizable presence. Of course, so I know you're thinking, well, why the hell would anyone get married?
I was like, why get married? Like, after this is laid out, I'm thinking I'm not going to get married.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah. Except here's the problem, is even though the law of coverture, while it was officially established in and through marriage, it poured over into the society as a whole, and it influenced how women were treated generally. So in other words, so women weren't recognized in courts of law. Women weren't invited to be part of establishing contracts. So the result of coverture is that a woman needed a man in order to engage in the most basic of transactions required for survival.
Oh. Okay. Okay.
Just like we're acknowledging the passage of the 19th Amendment, right? So that Seneca Falls, they were still fighting against coverture. They were challenging. So the law of coverture is deep in this country still, and we're still trying to work our way out of it. So it's not something that's purely of the past. We still have bits of it with us.
Okay, but in that time, when they came over, when it came over from England, Black women, we were not part of that. No one even looked at us as human, in terms of so this was literally just a law for Like
the
white
19th Amendment. Oh, the 19th Amendment for sure. I was going to say, the one thing that is so extraordinary, I think, about the history that I tell in Birth of a White Nation is that African American women and men during this brief period, and in particular for those who could get out of slavery, they really had the same rights and privileges as an English person of the same class. And so, right? But of course, by the time the United States becomes the United States, this country is deeply invested and invested in white supremacy and the degradation of persons of African descent, indigenous people, and frankly, everyone seen as not white.
Okay. Okay. You know what this is? I mean, this is so much. I can imagine when you're sitting, you know, and having these conversations with other people, with other white folks. You know, I don't know how. I mean, does anybody ever just get up and like walk out? Has anyone ever done that? You know, when you're talking. I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot for me to hear as a Black woman. But I could just imagine how, you know, someone who's not ready to hear this information.
Right.
You know,
well, again, most of the time I'm invited. So people, generally people who are there want to be there, or their boss is there who keeps them there.
Oh, okay. You know what I mean? Even if they feel so uncomfortable, they want to get up and walk away, they just have to sit there.
Yeah. So I haven't really had, I mean, I've had, in the local community here, I've been invited to speak, and we had some Breitbart people, you know, who showed up, but they came to try to just challenge and redirect. But, you know, I've been doing this a long time, and I can absolutely know when somebody's really asking a question or they're doing something else.
Yeah.
So I just find you name it and move on.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'm telling you, everybody, if you have not seen Hoppy, you got to check it out. And hear more from Dr. Badalore. This is nice. This is like really the behind the scenes of all the things that you say in, you know, in the piece. So let's go on back to law. So the naturalization law.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Can you just you know, elaborate on that, the stipulations, you know, and the establishment of the naturalization law?
The Naturalization Law of 1790, it was passed by the very first Congress of the United States of America. So basically the founders, who then became Congress people for the founding Congress, they had to establish all the laws of this brand new nation, including laws regarding immigration and naturalization. Now, natural immigration, of course, addresses who can come into a country from the outside its borders. And naturalization provides the legal process one must go through when you're not born in the United States, but you want to become a citizen of it. It's called naturalization. And so our founders determined that in order to naturalize a citizen of this brand new country called the United States of America, one had to be white. The requirement of being white, and to me, it's really significant, right? Because it shows that from the very first law in colonial North America, where we first saw this group of people called white people asserted for the very first time, which was in Maryland in 1681, that idea called white people and the superiority that was assigned to it. If you look at all these laws where white people were first referenced, you just can't get away from the fact that they were imbued with a meaning of being superior to all others. And so that idea called white people and their superiority had over 100 years to deepen in the hearts and minds, institutions, and structures of what would become the United States. And so that first naturalization law of 1790 just really helps sort of drive home how normative white had become and white supremacy. And it's also noteworthy that the requirement of being white to naturalize lasted more than 150 years.
Wow.
150 years. So people who fought wars for this country, but who didn't qualify as white, you know, weren't able to access U.S. citizenship. And this country, despite the fact that we've had laws that turn on whether one is white or not, we've never defined who's white as a matter of law.
You know, I was going to ask you, like, you know, when you said one had to be white, so if you were just like a light-skinned Black person, were you considered white? Like, I mean, was there any, like what made you white?
Right. Well, it's a good question. And so that was thought, what it meant was that contestations over who counted as white were decided ultimately in courts of law. There's a really terrific book by Ian F. Haney Lopez called White by Law. And he researches what were called the prerequisite cases, right? Because a prerequisite to naturalize was to first show that you're white. And so there were these legal battles, and some courts used one strategy to decide them, and other courts were using another strategy. And eventually it went to the Supreme Court, and they decided that what one set of courts was using science, although we would never count, it wouldn't count as real science today, to determine who's white. And another set of courts were using common knowledge. And of course, that was white men's common knowledge of who counted as white. And that's the version that the Supreme Court agreed with, the common knowledge.
The common knowledge
of privileged white men, really, because that's who the judges were. Decided who's white and who's not white.
Wow. When you start looking at these things, you see that it's really not that different. There's been some gains, but it's a lot of like just structural things are just still present.
Yeah. And that we're so uninformed of it too. Like, because one of the things people tell me is, all we're learning is white people history. And I'm like, we're not even learning that, right? We're learning some polished, glorified, half of it missing version of white people history, right? Only the good stuff, but terrible things that we white people have done to so many people who are seen as not white. It's heartbreaking, truly heartbreaking. And you actually mentioned something, Felicia, that like how hard it is for you to hear some of this history. And I want to acknowledge that and honor that.
Thank you.
And
thank you.
I want you to know that for lots of white people who hear it, guilt is a pretty heavy thing that grows for white people. And I just know that it's not a healthy place to stay. I know that I certainly had tremendous guilt when I first learned this. And I just know that it debilitates. It does nothing to change the structures that we live in. And I just found myself so freaking disgusted with my guilt self that I literally just decided enough. I'm going to choose to be empowered by this history and this knowledge, and enough of this guilt. I'm going to move.
Yeah. I mean, yes. And thank you so much for saying that. I think a lot of times that's the part you're so fearful that, as a Black person, listening and when we see white folks, feeling guilty, we're like, okay, but you feel guilty, but, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing? And so it's nice to see you doing something, like you've turned it. Because I believe that we all have to stay in feelings for a little while. We have to stay in place for a little while. Yeah. Because it helps to propel you to the next spot. So, yeah. Yeah, I want to start challenging more white folks. I'm saying, listen, you guys, look, Dr. Ballour wrote Birth of a White Nation. What you doing? We got to get this going.
But you know what? I want to say this, like I did write this book and I'm so proud of it. But really my greatest accomplishment has been just being and I'm still not by any means fully there. I still catch myself having these narratives about non-white people in my head that my culture and society have taught me. And so I don't want to pretend that I'm somehow in this land of white awareness. I have not arrived.
No. We all are. No one's there.
No, we're not. And but my greatest accomplishment is when I'm just able to see the full humanity of people who aren't white. Let me give another example. Like I had when I watched what happened to George Floyd, and I was not emotionally removed, but he felt like my child. Like when I felt that, I just knew that so much of what whiteness taught me, like to not care about him, to not see him as mine, my people. that was a big moment for me. Like I realized how much knowing this history and doing this work has helped me grow. And I got after the murder of George Floyd, I received hundreds of emails from white people, hundreds of them. What do I do? What do I do? And because I for the first time, you know, George Floyd's not the first person of African descent that we've seen these killed, you know, at the hands of those tasked with serving and protecting. And so that it felt like my humanity, that whiteness has very much damaged, has been significantly repaired for me. And I knew that for much of my life, I too would have asked, what do we do? What do we do? But I didn't have to ask that anymore because I knew the answer. Because the answer for me when I felt what I felt watching that was freaking anything and everything to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
You know, like every African-American mom and dad whose son or daughter has been lost like this, you do anything and everything to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah. 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 Okay. You know, neither one of us will be crying during this interview, Dr. Balbour. That's I'm just going to put that right out there. Because that was really okay, we're gonna move on. So the elite. Let's go back to the elite.
Yeah.
How did they benefit from the divided labor workforce, and how did the workforce become divided? You kind of touched on it a little bit.
Sure. Okay. Well, after Bacon's Rebellion, right? Because look, Bacon's Rebellion represented the unification of laborers from Africa and from Europe, those who worked on plantations, those who were small farmers. Like all of these people were pissed off at the ruling elite because the masses, the 99%, found themselves treated worse under worse conditions at the very time when a very small number in the colony were becoming filthy rich. And so the ruling elite knew that unification posed a threat to them, which was manifest in the rebellion itself. So they learned from that. And so again, they communicated this intent to divide and conquer. So what they did was through the invention of white people, they divided laborers into those that are white laborers and those that are not white laborers. And this group, the white ones, they gave a privileged status, right? Imbued, you can see in the very first laws that assert white people that they are presumed to be superior. And this group, the laborers who are not seen as white, prior to this moment, both of these groups were at the same place in the social hierarchy, right? So we have the 1% at the top, and then this was the bottom of society. But now, with the crafting of these laws and the assertion of white people, they stripped people of color from that place in society, and they dug out a new bottom to society, and they tossed people of African descent and members of Native American tribes within it. And so they began the initial divide of the masses. And truthfully, we white people have served the purpose of dividing laborers ever since. Think about if you know your labor history throughout this country. And it's no longer the 1% that even has to do it to us. Now white laborers will do it all by themselves.
So the politics in the U.S., like how have they been used to restrict non-white people from holding positions? Like from the beginning.
Really, how has it not? Right? It has the assertion of privilege to white people has given access and acceptance to white people from day one in this country, and served as a rationale to exclude people who aren't white. Right? Look, if you're going to have people in office, and and they're white, and we know that white people are superior, then those are the ones that we want. So just the hierarchy that race function, and let me also just say this to listeners, that white people, this idea called white people, was asserted some 100 years before Thomas Jefferson wrote notes on the state of Virginia, and before any of those naturalists, those pseudo-scientists who ranked humanities. So the concept of race happened at least 100 years later, right? So we had these, white people were invented 100 years before. So I just want us to see that to even say things are race at that time is not so accurate. Race didn't even become a concept that really applied to humans for almost 100 years.
Wow. And how long was Bacon's rebellion?
It lasted a little over a year.
Okay.
1676, excuse me.
Okay.
Through
Wow.
77.
All right. So they craft this plan, I mean, relatively quickly in terms of like how to, to shut down, to shut down the rebellion. This is, when you were talking about how someone from here, sent a telegram, was it telegrams back then? No.
Letters. Letters.
Yeah, letters. They, sent a letter saying, okay, we're going to, we have a way that we're going to divide and conquer. Who were those people?
Well, those were the English ruling elite. They were of the privileged class in England.
So we don't have names, though. We don't have like specific names.
Oh, sure. We could look up names. It's in the historical record. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but they're actually and you get lots of this information is actually now online. So you can dig into the especially in Virginia and Maryland, actually, the Burgess, Burgess, and if you look in, you'll see all their names, because the people who held political power were the same people who held economic power, right? Marx had it right. The two were the same, and so you'll see names. Not hard to look up.
Okay. Now, how does the ratio between the men and women like influence the new laws?
Sure. Yeah, well, in both the colonies of Maryland and Virginia, there was an incredible gender imbalance. There was about anywhere from 8 to 12 men for every woman in the colony.
Wow.
Yeah, and so women were a hot commodity, as you can imagine. And so another thing that we know is that if you can remember that gender imbalance, and then we had not an uncommon practice of men of African descent marrying English women, right? And the marriages were permitted, and we know that among the masses, among the 99%, they were accepted. There's not even a piece of anecdotal evidence that suggests otherwise, that those marriages were viewed in a negative way. But they were contested by the ruling elite, and they crafted this law in 1664, the lawmakers in Maryland did, that punished any English woman who married a, quote, enslaved Negro man. And the punishment was serious. She was enslaved for the duration of her husband's life, and any children that they have were enslaved.
Oh.
That law of 1664 was the precursor to a body of law that we call anti-miscegenation law. And anti-miscegenation laws were an invention of colonial North American lawmakers. They didn't come to us from England like most laws did. So that always tells us something about the needs and desires of those who wielded power. And anti-miscegenation law can be described as laws that made it illegal for white people to marry always persons of African descent, but sometimes various others. For example, California's anti-miscegenation law prohibited white people from marrying Mexicans, Native Americans, persons of African descent, Asians, and people from the Pacific Island.
But here in America, it was just Black folks.
Oh no, every anti-miscegenation law passed in North America, every one of them prohibited white people from marrying people of African descent. Some territories or states had anti-miscegenation laws that also prohibited white people from marrying various others, depending on the demographics.
You know, I hate to say that they covered all their bases, but they covered all their bases.
Right.
No, like,
and you look at the function of anti-miscegenation law, right? Because here's where you see coverture and other means of control kind of converging, because anti-miscegenation law functioned to make white women exclusive to white men as a matter of law. But when you fold in enforcement practices, we find that rarely, even though lots of white men were in technical violation of anti-miscegenation law, rarely were they prosecuted. And so when they were prosecuted, this was the line crossed, that they dared to treat their non-white significant other in a way deemed only appropriate for a white woman in public. That's the line that could get them prosecuted. But so when we look at anti-miscegenation law, we can see that it functioned to make white women exclusive to white men, and make all women, when you fold in enforcement practices, it made all women available to white men. And it located patriarchal power exclusively among and within white men. And so white women then became this commodity, right? Yeah. White women became a commodity that could be used to help support this whole idea called white people, right? It was a trade for white men. Yeah, you buy into this white people thing, and here's one of the goodies that you get: exclusive access to white women. And if you don't want white women, well, we'll let you have that too.
Wow. Okay. Why is the struggle in obtaining strong relationships between African descent and whites in this country? Like, why is there a struggle? I mean, in your opinion, what's like the biggest obstacle?
We live in the same moment, radically different lives, depending upon whether one is white or not white. Radically different lives, right? Like when I think about my childhood and the stuff I learned, I had a little white doll. I was given Barbie dolls, right? That they represented this ideal beauty. I went to Catholic masses where Jesus was a white guy with blue eyes, right? And whiteness was affirmed everywhere I looked. And so I was given this heightened, excessive self-affirmation racially all over the place. And so you contrast that with different people of color who grew up in a similar context. And that's why we have colorism within lots of groups, where you have a privileging of being lighter skinned, and you know, there's the psychology of it is sad and harmful and terrible.
Yeah.
But that's why because look, I'm so honored to have to get to be a part of Hoppy, and I never take for granted that my white self is a part of a distinctly African piece, you know, or community, or whatever it is. Like, I know that it's a real honor to be asked. And so, and I know that because I am shocked when a person of color extends kindness to me, because when I know the history that I know, it just seems like people should hate white people, non-white people. Yeah. You know, like the generosity of humanity on the part of people of color throughout this country's history is truly extraordinary.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that keeps us going. You know, it's not in the makeup of who we are, you know, to be anything other than, you know, than generous and loving and all that good stuff. Yeah.
We have a lot to learn from you.
Yeah. You know, I'm telling you, you did a good job in Happy. And if you guys haven't seen it, you guys need to see it. You need to see it. You need to see Happy.
Yes.
So, okay, I have so many other questions, but he's like texting me questions too. Everyone's just like this, you know, with this interview. So he wants us to go back to the laws, the miscegenate. I can't even say it.
I know it's a mouthful. Anti-miscegenation.
Miscegenation laws. So he just wants you to just elaborate a little bit more on those.
Sure. Well, the anti-miscegenation law, I really harp on people understanding anti-miscegenation laws. Just as informed people in this country, that body of law is something we should know about. And here's why. First of all, it was an invention of colonial North American lawmakers, which is always a flag should go up for us.
Yeah.
Secondarily, it is within anti-miscegenation law where we see for the first time in colonial North America, any reference to a group of anybody called white. So it's within anti-miscegenation law. Third, anti-miscegenation laws, again, laws that prohibited white people from marrying always people of African descent, sometimes others, lasted more than 300 years in this country. 300 years, literally shaping what we all look like. Not only that, but how we interact, even today, especially when it comes to dating and social intimacy. It is still influencing the people of this nation. And it was in 1967, anti-miscegenation law was finally struck by the U.S. Supreme Court when it in Loving versus Virginia, when it was found to violate the 14th Amendment.
Okay. All right. Wow. Okay. So going back to economics, well, socioeconomic obstacles that plague, you know, a lot of individuals in the African descent communities. Well, what are some of the socioeconomic, you know, things that are plaguing Black folks or of African descent, of the diaspora?
Yeah. Well, here's how throughout U.S. history, like we'll leave colonial North America aside for now, and that we'll just deal with U.S. history. There are thousands of laws that, by virtue of law, required that white people be given advantages. For example, U.S. housing law, right, passed in 1937, I think that's the date. It devoted billions to the construction of housing. And as a matter of policy and law, it required that contractors who are constructing housing, that if they're going to build a house that is going to be sold to a white person, it required that the entire development be white only. We actually we increased racial segregation in our country as a result of that law. Furthermore, as a matter of law and policy.
Here is a quick analysis after watching this video carefully. Historical accuracy with Jacqueline Batalora's speech. Batalora's work draws on historical and legal documents to support her claims. This gives her documents or her argument in this specific video a solid foundation. You know, Jacqueline Batalora's research contributes to a broader understanding of how race and racism have been shaped by legal and social forces. You know? Social implication as well. By highlighting the constructed nature of whiteness, as she explains, Jacqueline Batalora's work encourages a critical examination of racial privilege. It prompts discussion about how historical system of racial inequality continues to impact contemporaries' contemporary society. It is important to understand that the concept of race is a racial construct, and it has been used to justify many systems of oppression. The system of colonialism, the system of slavery, was a system that was invented out of the concept of whiteness. Whiteness in itself is not biological, but a legal construct. I want us to understand that. However, there's a controversy to all this. Jacqueline's Batalora's views can be controversial as they challenge deeply ingrained beliefs about race. I believe that anybody who has a valid argument will always have countermeasures, and what we are experiencing right now is Jacqueline Batalora having countermeasures to her arguments. Of course, she's going against multi-generation ideologies, you understand? So some may resist the idea that whiteness is a social construct, preferring to view it as a natural or a biological category. However, Jacqueline's Batalora's research provides important insight into the historical origins of racial inequality. So people need to understand, when Jacqueline Batalora is speaking, she's speaking of the social aspect of race. Whiteness is not a biological construct, whiteness in itself. So it has to mean something. This whiteness has to mean you feel you are like an angel, you are angelic. They came to Africa and they said Jesus was white, Satan was black, such kind of things. But even Jesus himself is not white. And also he's not black. He's like the people of his times. He's somehow Middle Eastern. How the Middle Eastern people looked like, or rather, if you like, the region of the name of the region around where Israel is today. Some people don't like calling it Middle East, but that region, you understand the concept. So these people were purifying, and they were whitewashing everything that they thought would make their narrative of oppression supported. And this is what Jacqueline Batalora is against. You'll ask yourself, but you are white, Jacqueline, why are you going against your people? No, she's not going against her people. She's going against oppression. We don't need oppression, We don't need that. So in essence, Jacqueline Batalora's work provides a valuable historical perspective on the development of racial categories in America. Her analysis in this video, her thoughts in this video, helps to dismantle the myth of race as a natural phenomenon and sheds light on the enduring legacy of systemic racism. You understand? That was Jacqueline Batalora. She is a passionate and an engaging speaker, addressing the complexities of what it means to be white within a nation that imposed racial hierarchy as a matter of a founding law. She's an author of that book, White Nation, The Invention of White People, and its relevance today. She's an attorney and a professor of sociology and criminal justice at St. Xavier University in Chicago, and a former Chicago police officer. Jacqueline serves on the board of directors of the Oscar Grant Foundation and is the founder of the annual third-day virtual conferences, Freedom to Learn Summer. You understand? So this woman is a woman who is composed. She was once a police officer, and we know how much police officers treat black people in the United States of America. And it's good that she made the right choice by being an attorney and being a professor. Many times he was being tempted to do wrongs to the black people while she was a police. I guess so, because it happens many times, Yeah. This is EFK Original Documentaries. If you like what I do, support me on Patreon. Thank you, and thank you so much for those people who support me. I really appreciate you guys. Are lovely. Yes. Thank you, and thank you again. See you in the next one. Yeah. Support me on Patreon. Yeah. Do your best. Thank you.